When the Peterson family moved from the busy streets of Chicago out to the rural farmlands of Iowa, they were expecting a quieter, simpler life. What they got instead was a nightmare beyond imagination. It all started normally enough. Alex Peterson had landed a new job as a software engineer in Des Moines, so he and his wife Emma and their 8-year-old twin boys Evan and Eric picked up and moved to a house on the outskirts of a small rural town. The white 2-story farmhouse sat on 20 acres of land that had a few farm fields and an old weathered barn out back. The boys loved racing around the fields and exploring the creaky barn, although Emma warned them repeatedly to be careful and not go inside without supervision. She worried they may get hurt on the steep drop-off where the loft sat or get splinters from the old, unkept walls. Still, the allure of adventure made it hard for rambunctious 8-year-olds to resist doing some unpermitted barn climbing when their mum wasn't looking. It was on one of these clandestine trips into the off-limits barn that Eric made a strange discovery. There, tucked into a forgotten corner covered in dust and cobwebs, stood an eerie, life-sized scarecrow. Its burlap sack face was painted with a crooked frown, and its straw-stuffed clothing hung limp and tattered on its lanky frame. Eric called Evan over to see his spooky finding, and the two examined the scarecrow with mild curiosity and fascination, while also feeling a bit unsettled by its grim appearance. But eventually the dust and musty smells of the barn drove them out into the late afternoon sunshine to play. As the twins grew bored of games like tag and hide-and-seek, Evan dared Eric to touch the scarecrow in the barn, an idea which sparked reluctant interest along with nervous anxiety. They snuck back into the barn, and Eric tentatively reached out towards the limp figure. But as his trembling hand made contact with the scratchy burlap shoulder, the scarecrow suddenly shifted, its head turning slightly with a crinkling sound that made the boys jump. They screamed and went racing back to tell their mom about the moved scarecrow, begging her to go look, although secretly worried she wouldn't believe them, but still hoping for her reassuring comfort. Emma placated them by following them back to the barn and examining the supposed scarecrow, but it stood motionless once again. She figured a breeze must have blown through and caused the abandoned decoration to shift. The mannequin-like stillness of the figure now drew her into believing it was harmless. Perhaps they could have some fun creating stories about the farmhouse's former owner leaving it behind, she suggested to the boys' half-worried, half-embarrassed faces. She urged them not to worry themselves over silliness and called them back into the house for dinner, as the sinking sunlight left behind long shadows that seemed to cling to the dilapidated barn. Evan lingered and stared as the dark hollows encroached around the unmoving but somehow ominous form of the scarecrow. That night, as the family slept, a wind whistled outside, stirring fallen leaves that scratched against the house as they scurried by. Inside, young Eric tossed and turned as troubling visions filled his dreams, burlap sacks, splintering wood, shadowy figures jerking in stiff, unnatural motions. The visions overwhelmed him until he startled awake, sitting upright in his bed and listening to the branches tapping a lonely late-night song on his window. Feeling unsettled and thirsty, he decided to sneak downstairs for a quick drink, although that meant sneaking past the creepiness of the hallway shadows near the stairs. As he quietly descended, a shape at the bottom startled him. He froze in fright until realizing it was only the scarecrow, but how could that be? Confused thoughts raced as he struggled between the fear flooding his body and the sense that what he was seeing was impossible. The scarecrow stood at the foot of the stairs, dim glimpses of its burlap face barely visible in the moonlit darkness, head cocked sideways in Eric's direction. In a small, trembling voice full of disbelief, Eric asked, "Scarecrow? What are you doing here?" The wind let out a mournful howl outside as the branches tapped more insistently at the window, and at that same moment, the scarecrow jerked its body into a shuddering motion akin to a twitchy, unbalanced dance before shambling towards the steps. With a gasp of horror, Eric turned and scrambled frantically back up the stairs on all fours. Slamming into his bedroom, he shook his brother Evan awake and hysterically tried to explain what he saw. Evan, startled from sleep, could barely comprehend the freaked-out stammerings, but knew his brother was terrified. Eric kept repeating, "It moved. The Scarecrow moved. It came inside." Their fearful voices stirred Emma awake, who tried to understand what Eric was so upset about. Just then, heavy footsteps shuffled slowly up the stairs as the floorboards groaned under some heavy weight. Emma quickly ushered the boys behind her towards the bedroom door and peeked into the hall. The shuffling stopped, and all was quiet for a moment. The boys crouched frozen with panic gripping their hearts, until Emma let out a frustrated sigh, saying, "Nothing but shadows out here." She figured Eric had been plagued by nightmares, and his overactive imagination coupled with darkness had exaggerated ordinary house sounds into something terrifying. After giving him some warm milk and tucking the boys back into bed with extra reassuring snuggles and reminders that nighttime can play tricks, she eventually got everyone calmed down again. Emma decided tomorrow they'd have Alex check around outside for animal tracks or anything else that may have somehow scared Eric. As she drifted asleep, comforting thoughts of logical explanations eased her mind. Morning sunlight washed away the memory of those late-night terrors as the Peterson family started their day. Over breakfast, Eric explained his vivid Scarecrow dream to his dad, which unnerved Alex slightly, but he kept a calm, reassuring facade. Soon the dream was forgotten, as the boys begged Alex to go with them to explore by the creek that ran near their property. They coaxed him into a promised few minutes of adventure before he had work meetings to jump on. Emma smiled as she watched her boys excitedly follow Alex outside, but a flicker of worry tightened her chest for a moment when she glanced out to see the old barn looked darker than usual, sitting there in morning light. Shaking off the passing thought, she finished clearing the dishes from breakfast. 20 minutes later, screams ripped through the peacefulness. Emma dropped the dish she was washing and ran towards the awful sounds of Eric and Evan shrieking and crying. Bursting outside, she followed the wrenching sobs around the house where the agonizing scene unfolded in front of the barn doors. Alex lay broken and bloody, face frozen in a horrified scream, body mangled with bones jutting at unnatural angles. And standing over him were the twins, faces streaked with tears, curled in terrified balls at the feet of the Scarecrow from the barn, who slowly stretched out its long bony fingers towards their cowering forms. Emma reacted on pure instinct, shrieking, "Get away from my boys!" as she ran and threw herself fiercely at the burlap sack devil. But as she clawed at its neck, the Scarecrow swiftly grabbed her wrists in a crushing grip. She struggled helplessly, yelling at the boys to run, although they remained paralyzed in shock and horror. The monster slowly turned its head to face her, shadows swirling where eyes should be under its dark hat. A gravelly, inhuman groan emanated from somewhere deep inside as it studied her defiant expression. In that terrifying moment, Emma knew with pure animal certainty that she was going to die at the hands of this gruesome living nightmare. But if it was the last thing she did, she was determined to save her beloved sons from the same fate. Survival instinct took over, as with her lungs burning from lack of oxygen, she dropped all her weight down with the power of adrenaline coursing through her veins and twisted herself free from the iron grip. She fell towards the bloody, lifeless body of her husband and shrieked with rage for the boys to run as she launched herself once more at the tall, looming figure. This time, her unexpectedly aggressive assault made the heavy creature lose its footing. She violently shoved again with every shred of power left in her body, and flesh met cloth and straw in a tangled heap, hurtling down into the darkness of the barn's entrance. Emma scrambled to her feet just as the first splintering crunch echoed up from below, along with an unearthly scream of rage. She grabbed Evan's and Eric's shaking hands, and together they fled blindly towards the dirt road that passed by their rural property, stumbling on jellified legs away from the horror scene. They ran until Emma couldn't take another step, lungs and limbs burning. She collapsed to her knees sobbing, pulling the boys close as they all cried, and began desperately trying to process what had just happened. After some time, Emma's thoughts cleared from the shock fog, and she realized the evil that had invaded their lives was probably still there. They couldn't stay outside, unprotected with that stalking them. Barely keeping her voice from shaking, she urgently told the kids they had to get to the police right away. Sticking to the tree line for cover, they slowly made their way towards town on wobbly, adrenaline-drained legs. About a mile down the dirt road, a rustling in the bushes made them freeze. Emma pulled the boys behind her and frantically searched the tree line for signs of the Scarecrow. When an older farmer emerged pushing a wheelbarrow instead, Emma almost collapsed in relief. Seeing their distraught faces, the farmer asked if they needed help or to use his phone. Emma tried to calm herself enough to explain what had happened, but knew she wasn't making any sense. The skeptical look on his leathery face increased her hysteria, so she simply implored him to please call Sheriff Jones immediately because something terrible happened at their farmhouse. Sheriff Jones arrived quickly to the farmer's property, where Emma and the twins had waited under the watchful eye of the farmer's wife, who had brought them water and sandwiches while taking about shock and disbelief on her husband's face. Emma struggled to convince the sheriff that she wasn't crazy, that something evil lurked back at her house. Her frantic emotional explanations seemed suspect and surreal. The sheriff followed Emma's ragged directions towards the Peterson farm, already wondering if the city woman was having some manner of breakdown, being out here removed from busy Chicago streets. He wondered if her bleeding heart animal rights beliefs caused her to overreact to normal sights on a working farm. As they approached, however, the metallic scent of blood tickled his senses just moments before the nightmarish vision appeared. His stomach clenched reflexively to see Alex Peterson's contorted corpse in front of the gaping maw that was the barn entranceway. Sheriff Jones tried to quickly direct the boys away from seeing their father gruesomely splayed a few feet away. He urgently told Emma to take them back to the patrol vehicle. There was no doubt now that something terrible had happened here, although his mind couldn't yet make sense of the scene. He examined Alex's tortured remains looking for clues, glancing towards the silent barn. There didn't seem to be animal tracks or clear signs of what caused such trauma, but the dried blood surrounding the body indicated Alex had been viciously attacked by something. Lost in the urgent need to record details, catalogue evidence, and essentially do his job in the only way he currently knew how to process this situation, a crinkling sound from the barn failed to immediately grab his attention. It wasn't until the rhythmic thumping footsteps registered that he jerked his head up. Where moments before the large opening had stood empty, there was now a figure shuffling jerkily into the light. Sheriff Jones froze briefly when his brain translated the image of what almost appeared to be a life-sized doll or mannequin of some sort, made of cloth and straw, lumbering towards him. It took a blink before realizing this abomination was moving on its own volition, no strings or prankster attached. His stunned hesitation cost him as adrenaline surged too late. The Scarecrow's long arms stretched outward more quickly than seemed possible, and bony fingers clamped tightly around Sheriff Jones's neck, lifting him off his feet. The sheriff clawed at the digits crushing his throat, feet kicking uselessly in the air. Within moments his movements slowed as oxygen and blood flow ceased, the sheriff's bulging eyes taking a final blurry snapshot of the mindless hatred on a ragged burlap face before eternal darkness descended. The snapping echoes of breaking bone punctuated the thud as the Scarecrow tossed aside the sheriff's lifeless body. Its head swiveled slowly from side to side, seeking its next victim. After a pause, it seemed to lock onto a target, lurching purposefully towards the dirt roadway, where Emma clutched her crying children in her arms, inside the secure squad car, trying to soothe their heaving sobs and block their view from more horror. Word spread quickly about the tragedy and deaths at the Peterson farm. Police and other emergency responders swarmed the area to try to secure and understand the scene with little success. The broken body of Alex Peterson still lay in front of the barn, while Sheriff Jones had been dragged off into a nearby cornfield. Of Deputy Simmons, who had secured the scene first, no trace could be found. As tense daytime activity gave way to encroaching twilight, efforts shifted to protective modes. Families made sure their doors were locked up tight as rumours of some crazed attacker or rabid animal spread through town. Calls flooded the temporary emergency headquarters set up at the sheriff's office in town, with frightened people demanding protection and wondering why they hadn't caught the killer yet. As darkness deepened, an eerie stillness settled. The creatures of the night seemed to be holding their breath. When the power suddenly cut out, blanketing the entire area in perfect blackness, panic erupted. Battery-powered radios and emergency generators kicked on with their limited reach soon becoming obvious. Spotty communication between neighbouring towns confirmed this outage extended over the whole region. In the pitch dark, imaginations ran wild. Some wondered nervously if this was related to the horrific events out at the Peterson place somehow, or just unlucky coincidence. Others prayed for daylight while clutching weapons and staring sightlessly out windows into the void. No one dared to venture outside their barricaded homes, and so no one heard the rustling approach through cornfields and vastly stretching unprotected yards. No one saw shadowy movements stealthily encircling houses and buildings, methodically testing doors and probing weak points to gain entry. The occasional breaking of glass or a muffled shriek went unnoticed by neighbours hunkered behind deadbolts and drawn curtains. Over hours the creeping horror made its way closer to the centre of town, impervious to empty threat warnings shouted from locked basements or trembling flashlight beams swept across yards. The temporarily bolstered emergency response teams couldn't communicate rapidly enough to combat the randomness of the siege. All they could do was wait tensely for backup generators to repower so they could organise and try to face the terror threatening them from the darkness. In one house on Elm Street, a family of 5 was jolted from fitful slumber by a loud bang and tinkling crash of breaking glass. Father Andy ran to check each room, cautioning the rest to huddle together with makeshift weapons as his anxious wife counted children's heads repeatedly in the blackness. The heaviness of their fearful breathing was punctuated only by the crunch of boots across broken glass. Andy crept towards the living room to investigate, just as an emergency light finally kicked on, casting the front picture window scene into clarity. Backlit by moonlight through the shattered pane stood the silhouette of a tall, slender figure. As it turned to stare his direction, the weak golden glow vaguely illuminated burlap threads making up the expressionless sack face. Crooked painted features created shadows that swirled ominously under the frayed hat rim. Andy shouted, "Hey!" although his voice cracked mid-exclamation. There was a shuffling lurch forward, and Andy thrust out the fireplace poker gripped tightly in his sweaty hand. "Stop right there!" The figure kept advancing slowly with movements reminiscent of a choppy wind-up toy. Weapon extended fully, Andy braced to defend his family, although his mind raced trying to accept the nightmarish sight in front of him. The golden emergency light chose that moment to flicker out, submerging the room again into blindness. Only scuffling sounds tracked the figure's progress, followed by a strangled yell and heavy thud from Andy as he desperately swung into empty space before dropping to the floor. His wife's screams and the children's panicked cries pierced the blackness. Within minutes, the emergency power switched back on, illuminating far too many scenes of violence and destruction strewn about town. Reinforcements finally rolled in shortly before dawn to systematically clear and secure the area. Sergeant Klein made his way slowly down Elm Street, dreading what he would encounter, but needing to press forward. He came upon the Kevinsons' broken doorway first, confirming his grim expectations. Steeling himself, He adjusted the helmet straps digging into his chin and pushed onwards past another battered aluminum door. This unfortunate family was splayed across ripped furniture, leaking reddish stains, ripped clothing hinting at vicious attacks. The stench of death hung like fog in the wreckage. As he examined the splintered railing leading upstairs, a sound seized his attention. Muffled crying drifted from a hallway closet. Wrenching open the door, he discovered a young girl and boy hugging each other tightly, faces buried and hidden beneath each other's arms. Relief flooded him, realizing he had found survivors to shepherd to safety. In the weeks following the mass killings that had decimated families in the rural Iowa town inexplicably over one terror-filled night, the concept of safety felt elusive. Although thorough police investigations found seemingly rational explanations for a few attacks, being the work of opportunistic criminals or rabid animals, no solid leads ever emerged explaining the majority of deaths. The exploitable darkness and communication breakdowns had provided perfect cover for whatever evil had mercilessly ripped through everywhere unchecked before vanishing by daylight. Without clear target understanding, creating protection strategies felt hopeless beyond general vigilance and increased caution. Those who could move away did in droves, urgently needing distance from death-tainted memories. But for many families who had called this land home for generations, leaving felt less possible. Some clung to finding routine again, or armouring their homes against whatever darkness may lurk. But the echoes of lives destroyed resonated in every creaky floorboard. The tall corn swaying in the breeze visible through cracked windows seemed harmless by day, but still harboured ominous threats once sunlight faded. A collective weight of sorrow and dread lingered. When young widow Emma Peterson finally emerged from weeks sequestered in shocked mourning with her sons, the townspeople speculated endlessly but discreetly on what could have set off such violence, starting with that poor city family. Emma avoided prying eyes and whispered rumours as she mechanically sought to reassemble life without her beloved Alex. She believed people blamed her for stirring up a happy, simple town and felt all the judgment piled onto her slumped shoulders. Braving disapproving glances in town when necessities required errands exhausted her until she rarely left the property. Inquiries had confirmed the first attacks clearly traced back to the Petersons' farmhouse, where subsequent victims were strewn haphazardly across the land as though leading directly into town, wreaking havoc. Of course, law enforcement had thoroughly combed every inch, initially finding odd bare footprints Emma claimed belonged to the attacking Scarecrow that ended abruptly as though it had vanished. She hated how unbelievable she sounded, and eventually stopped torturing herself trying to make them understand. Something evil had darkened their door and ruthlessly torn her world apart. She no longer cared what anyone else believed, but dedicated herself fully towards helping her boys slowly heal from invisible wounds and navigate overwhelming grief. She clung fiercely to those last shreds of family, finding solace in simple routines. During aimless wandering one morning through the overgrown fields, Emma discovered the mostly intact Scarecrow dumped behind the crumbling barn, its clothing ripped and head carelessly torn half off. She stared transfixed at its limp rag-doll form, remembering the gruesome ferocity it contained that awful day Alex died. Rage boiled up and pushed her forward, hands searching for something, anything to strike out against the representation of her pain. Grabbing a rusted shovel, she bashed endlessly at the lifeless thing until it was an unrecognizable pile of bits, almost camouflaged within the long grasses. Breathless, she finally stopped, emotions churning before she turned and slowly walked back to the house. Burying horrors wouldn't remove them from her mind, no matter how much she wanted soothing peace again. Over the next year, Emma and the boys gradually adapted to existing within sorrow's lingering haze. Focusing on comforting familiarity and treasured memories of Alex kept their world functioning reasonably well, all things considered. Emma still constantly battled worry over their financial security and isolation out here, so far from emergency responders if anything threatened again. But starting over somewhere new, teemed with exhausting challenges too. This place held their last memories with Alex and offered comforting landscapes where the boys played imaginary adventures together through golden afternoons before trundling inside, muddy and smiling. The land nourished them even through pain, so they became part of the cycle again, season after season. By late next summer, the worst bitterness of tragedy's bite had numbed, allowing joyful moments to tentatively re-emerge when Emma smiled more freely again, or the boys laughed with carefree lightness once more. Cautious relief took root as their home felt cozy and safe again instead of crushing. One evening, while the boys caught fireflies outside before bedtime, Emma stood chopping vegetables in the kitchen when she felt the weight of unfriendly eyes watching. She slowly lifted her gaze towards the window over the farmhouse sink, expecting to see a deer or raccoon outside. Instead, she froze with heart instantly racing. Backlit by the setting sun, the silhouette of a tall, slender figure with the unmistakable outline of a tattered hat stood motionless in the pumpkin patch, staring directly at her. Without allowing herself time to think or question sanity, Emma immediately screamed for the boys to get inside the house. Her panicked urgency propelled them to instantly obey, dashing towards the door. Slamming it shut, she locked them all securely inside, trying to soothe their understandable confusion and fear. She stammered something about seeing a large animal, while her mind reeled, grappling to understand. How could anything have survived the brutal destruction she inflicted last year? Her hands trembled violently as adrenaline flooded her system, remembering how easily weapons and strength failed against such relentless evil before. What chance did they possibly have now? They huddled inside that night with chairs stacked in front of the barricaded door, jumping at every creak or rustle outside in the darkness. As sunrise finally crept back, casting golden streams of hope across their worn faces, after endless darkness slowly passed uneventfully, Emma knew she had to protect her family at all costs. She spent the morning loading their truck, preparing to leave this place forever. But glancing in the rear-view mirror at the receding farmhouse that held their last shreds of Alex, uncertainties overwhelmed her. The boys had already lost so much that anchored who they were. How could she take their home too? Maybe it had just been shadows playing tricks on her straining mind. Still, what if leaving now could spare them even potential harm? How would she live with herself if anything threatened her precious family again when she could choose to prevent it? Paralyzing indecision left the truck idling uselessly in the driveway for hours until lack of actual danger dissolved. The urgent need to decide anything just yet. Life almost returned to normal over the next couple months as back-to-school bustle took over daily rhythms without further sightings of the ominous figure. Emma hesitated telling anyone about what she saw, worried they wouldn't believe her, but even more afraid they would insist she uproot the boys immediately with winter on the horizon. Where would they go? How would they start over with nothing? Frozen by financial and emotional fears, she remained conflicted and silent, until late one afternoon when sharp screams pierced the brisk autumn air as Emma and the boys finished up fall-yard chores before dusk fell. Dropping everything mid-task, they all sprinted toward the ruckus sounding from the field beyond the rusting barn. Rounding the weathered structure, they skidded to a shocked stop at the nightmarish sight in front of them. There knelt their elderly neighbour, Farmer John. Screams turned to whimpers as he struggled to free himself from the tall figure clutching him in a headlock with one straw-stuffed arm. The other hand, holding a wickedly curved blade, rested against the farmer's throat, ready to slice, as John feebly tried pushing the weapon away. Emma spotted the overturned bushel baskets and scattered vegetables, indication Farmer John had likely been picking the last bounty of his harvest when attacked. Before she could even react, Both boys were shouting and grabbing anything nearby to hurl at the looming figure. Their packed snowballs and small stones bounced harmlessly off the burlap fabric, but grabbed its attention enough to turn slit eyes in their direction. It flung Farmer John aside like a rag doll, without even glancing to ensure where he landed. After whimpering breaths drained from his crushed body, there remained only the faint scritch-scritch rustling as the tall figure moved unnaturally fast in the boy's direction. Emma slammed into protective mode, sprinting and screaming wildly to place herself between the creature and her everything. She hurled herself at it, knowing she was no match, but determined to give them a chance to run, save themselves. She clawed and kicked, while ordering them to leave immediately in a broken voice, ragged from weeping. But before the boys could slip away unseen, old Farmer John weakly called out, "The medallion! Rip off the medallion round its neck!" Emma startled briefly, wondering if the old man was delusional from pain and fear. But urgency guided her fingers to tear at the front of its vest, feeling scraping metal. She grabbed the rusty chain in frenzied desperation, just as bony hands gripped her shoulders. Bracing for piercing agony, she wrenched with all her might. The chain snapped, and she fell forcefully away towards the winter-dead cornstalks behind her. There remained a heartbeat of stillness and uncertainty before the figure before them seemed to deflate slightly, its torso buckling inward without structural firmness as stuffing sagged. It tottered drunkenly, trying to regain footing while the painted sack head flopped limply. Before their astonished eyes, the horrifying creature crumpled toward the dry, stalk-laden ground, vacant hat settling upside down to mark the empty, ragged clothing. Stunned disbelief held them paralyzed for lingering moments, until Farmer John's pained coughing spurred Emma to motion the stunned boys check on him. As she rose on unsteady legs, solicitously turning the veteran farmer over to survey his injuries, catches of his mumbled words echoed in her mind. Demon's medallion, trapped inside, the only way to kill it. Could the most dangerous evil they'd ever encountered truly be vanquished that simply? Dazed relief flooded her weary body for the first time she could ever recall as the setting sun seemed to bless them all with merciful light. Later, as she bandaged John's substantial but not life-threatening cuts from the ordeal, Emma gently asked him to explain what had happened and what he knew about the demonic force that had haunted their land. In a voice punctuated by winces of pain, Farmer John shared an unbelievable tale from his family's oral history, passed through generations who had farmed this area for over a century. He described the medallion Emma now held tightly in her pocket, etched with arcane symbols and rituals used long ago to trap an ancient evil spirit that had made a sudden violent appearance set on blankets of fear and death. It had possessed a field scarecrow and set about attacking homesteads one bloody night, which triggered quite the manhunt by townsfolk over subsequent years, desperate to end its killing sprees whenever it would unpredictably reappear. After exhaustive research, her ancestor of John's had tracked down an ancient banishing ritual to bind the demonic force inside the gold medallion etched with mystical runes. But the ritual demanded a blood sacrifice, the life of the spellcaster himself, in order to seal the prison eternally. John's relative volunteered to make that sacrifice if it saved future innocent lives. So late one horrific evening, townspeople lured the possessed scarecrow back to that farmstead, and the ritual began once it was distracted trying to attack. As the spell sealed the medallion in blinding red light, the scarecrow violently seized before collapsing insulated as the trembling ancestor who had sacrificed everything gradually bled out nearby. His loving family buried him with honor for heroism beyond measure. They hid the warded medallion deep inside the barn's thick rock foundation, so none might accidentally release the evil again. As long as it remained undisturbed within its mystical prison, the entity stayed bound in helpless dormancy, while the scarecrow stood empty. The tragic tale inflicted immense pain, but finally granted them all a chance to heal and gave future descendants like John peace. until construction planning on behalf of the Petersons had unwittingly unearthed that cornerstone, cracked it open, hoping to widen the barn doors to fit modern tractors. With the medallion accidentally freed, the demonic force immediately slipped its bonds, escaping the prison to possess the empty host it could reach nearby, the long-forgotten patched Scarecrow discarded seasons before. Then the unholiest violence began again without warning. Farmer John sorrowfully apologized for not telling them the land's dark history beforehand. He knew the Petersons only wished for a tranquil place to call home, and had no reason to suspect digging projects might unleash evil. For generations the demons stayed sealed away, harmless and forgotten. He struggled internally over destroying the cursed relic to prevent anything like this again, but sacrificing his own kin as its next prison seemed too much to ask. Fear of breaking that cycle unintentionally kept him silent and withdrawn, trying to protect his neighbors rather than burden or endanger them. As autumn faded towards another winter and John's wounds slowly healed, Emma walked the quiet, frosted fields, often pondering everything that had happened there. So much love and loss saturated this land now. But instead of bitterness, she felt surprisingly strengthened, having conquered such imposing darkness. Farmer John offered them safe passage to stay in his guest cottage indefinitely while they decided next steps, but Emma gently declined. This place held everything dear. She refused to relinquish all they had rebuilt from both love and loss. She knew how to safeguard their farm now against ancient evils. She had found courage far deeper than realized. They would stay and thrive where they were planted. When golden sunset rays streamed across the rolling grasses each evening in calming beauty, she sometimes spotted the faintest, almost imperceptible shadows, but she knew it was only emptiness awaiting there across the fields, unable to touch their light ever again, thanks to those before them who provided well. The Peterson family had always been resilient through both laughter and tears, and they always would be.